So we're going to start. We're going to talk about neurological development, the developmental sequence, and how it provides the foundation for what we see in children as a natural and integrally developed resiliency. And I do wish I had more time because I have so much to share because my clientele includes all our traumatized kids. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I want to tell you guys how grateful I am to be here because so many places in the country where I speak, people have not even heard of developmental trauma. And they say, oh, that's a good phrase for what my child is going through. But it has not even come into their vocabulary. So to be able to speak with an audience of people who are already familiar with the term is really wonderful. And the second reason that I'm grateful to be here is that I spent the whole month of January working in Minnesota and Detroit, where the temperatures were minus 50 degrees and minus 30 degrees. And I had my son writing me from Seattle, texting me saying, do you realize it's colder where you are right now than the North or the South Pole? So it was brutal January. This is Kathy Gordon, and I want to introduce Kathy because she is working with me. She's a single adoptive parent of a 10-year-old boy, and she is a parent educator certified by Echo Parenting and by Hand in Hand Parenting, and Hand in Hand by Hand in Hand Parenting by Connection. Yes. And Kathy's really gifted at working with children with developmental trauma, and she's both helping me on this trip, and she is also available as a consultant. So is there anything you wanted to add?
Just that I schedule Betty's appointments when she comes to LA. She's based in Seattle. She travels to LA about 2 or 4 times a year to work with families here. So I'm the person you'll speak to if you either have a child that would benefit from Betty's work, or you have a parent who has a child. And in fact, I will pass around a notebook, and you can give me your name and email address, and then I can shoot you an email when Betty's going to be working with you. Yeah? Cool.
Okay. My name is Bette Lamont, and I have a center. I'm based in Seattle. I work around the United States and the UK, seeing children with developmental trauma. 100% of the clients that I work with are developmentally traumatized, and that developmental trauma arises from prenatal exposure to toxins, drugs, and alcohol, the intense chemistry of depression on the mother's part, the abuse within the family prenatally. I work with children who have been traumatized during the birth process, so that would include children with birth trauma like cerebral palsy. I work with children who are damaged postnatally by abandonment, by neglect, by trauma to the brain, by chemical poisoning, including heavy metals and toxins. I work with a great number of adopted children from China, from Ethiopia, from Guatemala, from all over the world. I see people all around the United States and the UK, and I come to LA about 3 or 4 times a year. So my background, just really briefly, because I want to get a lot of useful information to you, and we were to have a second half, we'd do a real practicum. But at least theoretically, I hope this information, the theoretical information, will be helpful. I have a background in education, teaching. I was going to be a high school teacher. I have a background in movement analysis and somatic therapies. I have a pre-chiropractic training, and I also have a degree in what's known as neurological reorganization. And the last category is the base for everything that I do at this time. I've seen about 5,000 clients since 1987 who've been in recovery processes, and they do exceedingly well with the work that we do. So in lieu of having a good 2.5 hours, one of the things that I have done is to give you a copy of a preliminary report by an attachment therapist who has changed her whole attachment practice by understanding what neurological trauma does to the brain and to the personality and to our sense of well-being. And so this paper by Denise Best, she wanted you to know it's her first draft, but I said, please, can we get it out there because it's loaded with information. It's a bit long, and I really want to thank Echo Parenting for printing it because she describes so well many of the clients that we work with. So I'm going to present to you a chart, and we're going to have fun talking about it. It looks a little bit daunting, but we're not going to cover the whole thing. And I tell a lot of stories, and the reason I tell a lot of stories is that's how we learn. And until we get our work certified as a graduate program at Antioch University or one of the other more open-minded universities, it is primarily the stories of children and the testimonies of their parents that inform us about how we are doing. And I think we are doing really very well. So you have a copy of this in front of you, and I would invite you not so much to look at all the words on it, just to kind of look at the progression of neurological functions, each of which provides a foundation for the level of the brain above it. And I would invite you to think about the children with whom you work as you're looking at this. And we're not going to trace this whole thing all the way up to the top. That's the 2-week course. We're going to trace first 3 levels of development. And in a sense, the talk that we had yesterday morning, Janine, right, was this is going to deconstruct that even a bit more. What's happening in the brain to children who are traumatized? So as you're looking at this chart, one of the things that's missing is a kind of good divider right here in the middle, right there, because on this side of the chart, we are talking about how our brain learns to take in information from the day that we're born up until the time that we start walking and talking, or until until 8 years old. The other side of the chart has information about how our brain puts out things into the world. So how do we move around, our gross motor? How do we use our hands, fine motor, and language competence? And when we're looking at children, we see this as really foundation building. If there are any gaps in that developmental sequence, there are likely to be gaps in their capacity and ability to be whole physically, socially, emotionally, academically, psychologically. So whenever we see gaps, we are looking at how we can fill those in. And I want to tell you that the work that we're talking about today, was the result of a research project that took several years going around the world to look at what happens in culture, every continent except Antarctica. A group of people went around the world to see what is common for infant development everywhere. If you take away specific cultural and religious influence, what does every baby need to do clear up through to about 6 to 8 years old to be neurologically whole, developmentally whole? And that took several years to condense down into a rather efficient look at the central nervous system, and that's what we're calling the developmental sequence. And when I'm speaking to you today, I'm going to speak in terms of absolutes, but I want you to know that I know that nothing in nature happens in absolutes. So you will forgive me for sounding absolute when in fact I know that development swells and surges and some pieces develop before others, and it's much more complex. So we're going to point out some of the things that are relevant for our children who are traumatized. Now, you have a copy of this in front of you, and we're going to start, let's see, I'd like to roll this down just a little bit further to the very, very bottom. Okay, you've seen my name, the name of my business up at the top. By the way, if you want business cards, I've got some up here. So when we are looking at a child, in our actual assessment process, we take a look at what is happening at birth, and then in the 2.5 to 7 month period, the 7 month period, and all of the stages of cortical development. Even before I start this, I want to talk to you because you do work with children with this kind of trauma. There's a whole level of development here that happens. We don't start developing when we're born. We start developing before we are born. And those of you who know Gabor Mate's work understand that the child who is the product of a distressed, depressed, alcoholic mother, or a mother who's going to give up that child, is already traumatized before they are born. And so I'm going to just tell you one little story before we get going on this rather daunting looking chart. About a little boy that we were working with, and I think I'm going to put this at the beginning. I'm going to take the risk of putting this at the beginning because I think you work with kids and it won't be totally surprising. I'm working with a little boy who was 5 years old at the time, adopted by incredibly loving, completely appropriate and fabulous family. Has a real mission to help children. And little Nate was a wild man, and he could run across the floor, up the walls, across the ceiling, and back down again before he, even consider hearing that you said come to dinner. His main mode of mobility was running. His main contact with the world was hitting and kicking and biting and pinching and scratching. He had been adopted after several foster placements when he was 2. And there's a piece of this work that's called fetal work, because we understand, having looked at research that comes out of a 27-year series of research projects, there are particular activities that the fetus needs to do before they're born. And after we'd settled down a few of Nate's issues, we decided, let's do some of this fetal work with him. And we started this first little activity, and it was quite uncomfortable for little Nate. He was very, very distressed. And finally, after 2 weeks, he sat up in his mom's lap and he said, "Babies aren't safe in tummy mommies." I was scared. Babies aren't safe in tummy mommies. And the mother went, "Wow, what do we have here?" And she said, "Let's pretend I'm your tummy mommy, and I can't wait for you to be born, and I can feel you moving, and you can take up all the space you need." And after a few weeks of this, and after that kind of little breakthrough, he calmed down and started attaching to this new mother. But what's very striking is that we assume, or probably most people in this room don't make this assumption, but the general culture at large makes the assumption that what happens in the first years doesn't matter very much because they don't remember it. And I've actually had a physician say to one of my clients, completely dubious about what we were doing, he said, "The first year doesn't matter because they don't remember it anyway." So that is still the state of some pediatrics practices in probably other parts of the country, but maybe even here. So we do work with those children that are traumatized before they're born, but now we're going to progress on to take a look at this chart of normal neurological development. And what I'm going to do is jump between what happens in normal development and then what happens if there is aberrant development, if somehow it's interrupted, if it's disrupted, if the child is injured. So at this first level of the central nervous system, what we're looking at is what happens at the medulla and spinal cord. Right when we're born, baby first pops out of mom, they're just all ready to go. They don't have much of their brain available to them. In fact, the only brain they have available in most cases is the medulla and spinal cord. And the brain becomes available by a process called myelinization, in which this white fatty material grows up and surrounds the nerves to help them fire, much the same way that this wire to the computer has to have an insulation around it in order to be effective. Otherwise, the signal would short out and we wouldn't have this picture up here. So at birth, we are myelinized about to here. And our newborn baby has very specific reflexes. It's primarily reflexive, survival little person. So this baby's going to have a light reflex when you shine the flashlight in their eyes. Their pupils contract, and you take the light away, and they open back out again. And I can tell you a brief little story, not about a child, but about an adult that I'm working with who has schizophrenia. And by the way, this work has been used in Germany to treat schizophrenia very effectively. But this little, this woman has very interesting situation. Now, at this point, at this stage, we start to see colors. The colors come in. First black and white, and then red is the first color that we see, which is why, a lot of the baby toys are black, white, and red. Or some of them that are that. What she said to me is, "I don't know why, but every time I get angry or scared, everything turns red." She said red would bleed out, like so the red bucket over there, and there's a kind of reddish box, and then the red on Kathy's shirt. She said everything would turn red. She said, "No one has ever described what's happening to me." And to me, it made complete sense that for this woman, as she got distressed and her brain stopped compensating well, it was almost like her visual system, not her language system, not her mobility system, simply her visual system regressed to that of a newborn. There are other reflexes that occur here. The little startle reflex with this newborn baby, if you go like this, their whole body goes into startle. And for some of our children, they still have that. We'll talk about why. There's a Babinski reflex and lots of little reflexes up the body. There's a reflex called the spinal galant reflex, which is a little reflex that we need very much to be born. As the baby comes down the birth canal, their back touches the wall of the birth canal, and they participate in wiggling themselves out. And then after they're born, they do very specific things that they need to do in order to dispense with that reflex. And the little children that can't sit in the chair, that are constantly sliding out onto the floor, the third grade teacher says, he's on the floor 4 times a day. Suddenly, accidentally, he's on the floor again. They may have a retained reflex right there. Our newborn babies certainly can't go anywhere. You can put that newborn on their tummy. Their arms and legs will wiggle. They have, movement, but it's not going to get them anywhere. Their cry starts out as a little announcement of their presence. It sounds like a little kitty cat mewing. Here I am, this is me. And with their hand function, you have the grasp reflex. So you hold on very tightly. They'll hold on very tightly if you put your finger in their hand. Now, when I work with anyone that has any injury there, they're usually paralyzed, comatose, or mute, or unable to, they can't see or they can't hear. And I've worked with maybe 5 people in my career of working with about 5,000 people who have started working with me in a coma. And we have a couple of wonderful recoveries, and I can talk to you all about traumatic brain injury if you're interested outside of the context of this lecture. We're going to start looking at just 2 levels today in the time that we have, and I want to talk about their ramifications for trauma. At this level of the central nervous system, which may start developing as early as a month, may start developing as late as 5 months, but on average about 2.5 months. This little baby is beginning to look in your eyes intensely. They see an outline, but their favorite outline is the human face, and they are drawn to gazing at their mother's eyes. And what they're looking at is the pupillary size. So if the mother's pupils are relaxed and she's calm and happy, the baby starts creating oxytocin, which you've heard that word before in this workshop, that sort of love and cuddle hormone. The baby will create oxytocin. If the mother looks stern, angry, her pupils are small, and she's, her body language is sensing distress, the baby will start producing cortisol. And it's a really interesting thing about which is a stress hormone. And actually, stress hormones damage the brain. In excess, stress hormones will kill neurons. It's interesting that when the baby starts producing oxytocin, it goes through into the mother's body, and mother starts producing oxytocin. And it is critical for that bonding process, just that I am here and I'm loved and I'm safe. And I work with many, many children from orphanages. I might have 150 Chinese adopted girls in my practice who were bundled, completely bundled, and laid on their backs in cribs until they were a year old, and no eye contact except to be, if they were fed, maybe there was a generous caregiver who might give them a moment of comforting. Now, at this point, this little baby, they were still responding to sounds that they perceived to be threatening. So if that door were to slam, and we had a baby between about 2.5 and 7 months old in the room, they would, wah, wah, if a dog barks near them. But they're not jumping at every little sound. They're not jumping at somebody setting a glass on the table or putting down a book. And this vital cry is part of that sort of what I call the cycle of trust, and Janita referred to it on Monday too, or yesterday. That vital cry is supposed to evoke in us. It's supposed to evoke chemistry that causes us to go see what's wrong with that baby. In fact, no sane adult, and I want you to hear what I just said, no sane adult can be in the presence of a baby at that age crying like that and ignore that cry. And when we come and we see what the need is, we care for that need, we then create a sense of empowerment in the baby. I have a need, I can have my need met. So I have power in the world. So that when we are coming to take care of that baby, I think all of you know we're not spoiling that baby. However, many of your clients if you are working in the field, may feel from the very beginning, I'm not going to spoil my baby. And immediately, that is a violence to the child, because coming to meet their needs is a way of saying, you have a right to be here and you have power. Now, oops, what happened here? What happened there? Okay, well, we can deal with this. Oh, look at that, I'm writing things on my chart. I don't know how, oh, there it is. Okay, now, I want to talk about tactile responses at this stage, because at this stage, the brain is particularly alert to extremes of heat and cold and pain and hunger. This is their major concern. I'm not saying they don't feel it before or after. I'm saying this is a major concern, because this is a very life-preserving brain. The primary concern is, how do I stay alive? So if I'm too hot, I'm going to scream until someone comes and cools me off. If I'm too cold, I'm going to scream. If I'm in pain and if I'm in hunger, if I have hunger. I work with many children who don't feel pain, and I want to pause at this point for 1 minute to emphasize that pain, while we think of compassion as a very high-level human function, the roots of compassion start by knowing, I know that I can hurt, so I know when you are hurting. I work with so many children, and it's probably 20% of my practice, children who do not feel pain. And a very good example is a child I just saw in Minnesota last month who was playing soccer. He's an adopted child with definite neurological issues, ran across the field, fell down. His parents said, off the field, off the field. He said, I'm fine. You want to finish the game, you know. At the end of the game, he was still walking really funny. They ended up taking him to a physician, and he had a compound fracture, and he was playing soccer on a compound fracture. I work with children who cut themselves as they get older. I work with children who are oblivious to pain. Often they're the playground bully, and once you realize that not feeling pain can be the first little seed of compassion in your neurology, you will realize that the playground bully is someone to have compassion for. If someone's bullying your child, you can turn and look at that child and say, this is an injured child, and that's why they are bullying, okay? That's a piece of it. So I've worked with children who, and more particularly on the autism spectrum, who never get hungry. I worked with one boy whose the only thing he would eat was Cheetos and green beans. He would eat nothing else. I mean, and he would eat those once a day, rarely hungry. Now, is this anorexia? Not particularly. Anorexia has a particular profile of a psychological profile, but that psychological profile only appears to manifest as true anorexia when we have this concomitant piece of an inability to truly feel hunger. So many of my kids won't eat. I have worked with children who have scalded themselves in baths that are too hot, and I had in Minnesota, and I want you to hear this, it was minus 50 degrees. I work at a place called A Chance to Grow, which is a fabulous facility. There should be one in every city. It's wonderful, and I can talk about that later. But a little boy who ran out the door in his bare feet to get into the car. And we saw him and were racing after him, and he ran so fast. Then he ran back, and he said, the car's locked. Unlocked the car. He had no concern for his feet. Now, at 50 degrees below zero, you can have 5 minutes exposure before you start losing parts of your body. And here he is running out there in his bare feet. That's a high threshold for cold. When we don't understand heat, cold, pain, and hunger, we don't understand something very fundamental about our being. And our children can end up risk-taking. They can end up hurting others. And they also may very deeply lack the very seeds of compassion. I have a letter from a mother when her son finally made that leap. And it's big capital letters, we have compassion. Now, I want to do a little aside here and say I work with the best parents in the world. And I know some of you are working with parents who seem to not have any idea what this little one is about. I work with parents who have read every book they can read and puzzled through every therapy to see if it's the right one. And I do need to put this in here that, of course, it's in the context. All the growth and change is happening in the context of appropriate, loving, and nonviolent parenting. And I'm really, really lucky because those are the parents I get to see. As hard as the kids are, the parents are really amazing. So we need to have that function. And it's one of the things I was going to, if we had a longer time, I was going to do a practicum to give you some tools. But one of the things that I would like you to note down is something you can see in your clients is if they seem to have that inability to feel pain, and if that correlates with any of their emotional responses. It's a profound insight once you see how it all connects out. The playground bully who slaps his mama in the face, who runs out in traffic because he doesn't recognize danger, who pours baths that are too hot. You go, oh, yes. Now, I want to tell you something that's really interesting about how this brain is triggered to develop. And I want to tell you, as we're going into some of the movement things, that I do work in London, and I work in nurseries where the population that brings children to that nursery is very, very poor, in very, very small apartments, where the babies are put in little push chairs and never let out for the first year. And so these babies developmentally are much like newborns by the time they get to the nursery, if they get to the nursery like at a year or later. So we are instituting developmentally appropriate activities for these children that take them from that very early birth process all the way up. The thing that the babies will start to explore under this mobility category when they are, let's see, oh, look at that. I'm just messing this up. There we go. I hope that doesn't save. The thing that they are doing down here is that they're on their tummy. And when a baby gets on their tummy, they start to move forward. Eventually, they figure out how the arms and legs work. And this activity, I'm going to call it crawling. And you might think of it in another way. I apologize. But if you go look at the U.S. Army, they crawl on their tummies. They creep on their hands and knees. U.S. government defines it that way. So I'm kind of stuck with it. But babies on their tummies are doing some really important things. One is that when they're down on their tummy, that little torso is kind of locked there, and they're getting range of motion in the proximal joints. The proximal joints are the shoulders and the hips. They start triggering their lumbar curve and their cervical curve so that they're going to stand upright. And thus, by the time they're ready to walk, they're not anywhere near that yet, but they're upright and their limbs swing appropriately off of the torso. You may work with children that do this. Little rounded backs, the whole shoulder girdle swinging, the whole pelvic girdle swinging against it, because they've never had a chance to do what infants need to do. When babies are on their tummies, they are beginning to use their hands. As they crawl, this beautiful thing happens. And if you don't think nature is a miracle, just look at this one piece. As the baby is tummy crawling, it evolves to something where the arm goes into an active reach and a passive turn, and an active reach and a passive turn. And they start, by the time they've completed, really fulfilled this neurological task, their arms go like this. So they get a function called supination pronation. Now, for all of those of you who are interested in pencil grip, all of the fingers, they have no muscles, they have tendons that connect up the arm into here. When the baby is tummy crawling, they are already establishing the things that they need to do to be able to write appropriately with a pencil by the time they are in first grade. It's so ingenious. Nobody could create a system like that, but the powers that be. I mean, it's just amazing to look at what happens. When they are on their tummies, they are triggering this horizontal eye tracking. Horizontal eye tracking is a function that we acquire at that level. I'm going to come back and talk about that because that's really important. When they're crawling on their tummies, they are beginning to in a sense, do a double click on that whole level of the central nervous system. What I mean by that is, if you have a computer here, you double click on the Windows icon and Windows opens, not to be prejudiced against Mac, because I really want a Mac, but I just happen to have Windows. But if you double click, it opens, right? And this is like a double click on the brain. We are all born premature. All of us are born premature because every other mammal stands up and starts walking around when we are the age of 1 year, but they do it at birth. We are born so prematurely, we're born a year prematurely. And every activity that we do, every activity is related to creating a healthy nervous system. Every activity that we do before we are a year old doesn't speak to reason, it doesn't speak to behavioral approaches, it doesn't speak to emoting and expressing your feelings. These lower levels of the central nervous system respond to reflex, movement, and sensation. That's the only language, not Dutch, not German, not French, not Spanish, not English. Not talk therapy or play therapy, but reflex, movement, and sensation. Over the course of the last 30 years, while I've been in practice, boy, almost that long, it's scary. But I've watched waves of things go through the culture. So there's a wave of a lot of basis and movement activities, not to mention any specific programs. Then there was a big wave of emphasis on sensory work. And then there's a big wave of emphasis that's now occurring about reflexes. It's all about reflexes now. And what I want you to know is if you want a mature brain, you work globally. You work with the continuing progression of all reflexes, movement, and sensation that happen at 7 different levels of the central nervous system and beyond. I mean, the brain keeps growing far beyond that. But these little babies, they do need to crawl on their tummies because, in fact, that is built into the system. Every child in every country in the world who's unimpeded and unimpaired, given that opportunity, they will crawl on their tummy, and given the time to do it, they will develop it all into a very specific form that enhances visual motor, postural reflexes, and in addition, this level of the central nervous system, one of the things that we talked about is that it is the part of our central nervous system that is life-preserving. And one of the things that we have realized is that the baby properly treated and compassionately and lovingly and nonviolently treated during this phase of development creates a hormonal set point so that they tweak their brain either towards a cortisol-based brain, I am unhappy, the world is not safe, I don't belong here, or towards an oxytocin-based brain, which is love, connection. A cortisol-based brain can't learn well. Cortisol, the whole, imagine yourself, somebody just rear-ended you on the freeway, and then for some reason your banker is in the car next to you and slides in the car and says, can you bounce that checkbook for me, please, because we're real unclear about the bank and what's going on in your checkbook. What state of mind would you be in? Now, there's no possibility to learn. So we can help establish the sense of safety and peace, and that oxytocin-based brain, which triggers the hippocampus. Oxytocin triggers our hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. If we want to have kids who learn, we have to have kids who feel safe. So Ruth is absolutely right. We have to get rid of any sign of violence in the school system. We have to get rid of all violence because children will not learn in the presence of violence. They can repeat, they can mimic, but they can't learn. And curiosity and exploration are a product of an oxytocin-based brain. So I look very intensely at what's happening with their tummy crawling and with their pain threshold. I look intensely at what is happening with their horizontal eye tracking, which is a function of this level of the brain. Our kids can't read unless they can track words across the page. Another thing that happens at this point, let me see, where in the world is that? There. Another thing that happens at this stage is their hand starts to release, starts to open up. You can put your finger in the baby's hand and they still hold on tightly, but you put much pressure, the hand is going to open up again. Now, anyone who's ever felt really extreme distress will do the fetal hand. excuse me, like that. It's a way to go into the fetal position without letting anyone know how distressed you are. I work with little children, and I'll ask them something simple, like, can you write your name? And if I see them doing this while they're starting to write, I know I've just already freaked that child out just by asking him to write his name, the thumb and the fist. It's what we do. And so if you have a child that's constantly walking around with the thumbs and the fists in your practice, you can know that whatever is in the environment is already freaking them out. And you might want to do something about it to ameliorate that problem so that you can do any work. Because remember that the cortisol-based brain can't learn. So this brain is very, very foundational to all the growth that's yet to come. At this midbrain, hang on here, there we go, little green dot. Our children at this stage, between about 7 and 12 months on average, but starting as early as 3.5 months, become very, very social. This is our social brain. We are pack animals. Any pack animal has a series of body language activities that they do to communicate. So your neighborhood dog, dogs are pack animals. If they plant their feet, tip their head, and go like that, every dog in the neighborhood knows that means let's play. And we have children that we work with who have less sort of body language awareness than your neighborhood collie, which is unfortunate because then the whole group of dogs will kick out a dog that doesn't have that body language. In packs, wolves, they'll kick out the inappropriate wolf. The dogs, they'll beat up the inappropriate dog if they don't read the body language. We're a lot smarter than that, so we teach our children how to look at the child with Down syndrome or with cerebral palsy and have space for that child in our hearts. However, before they learn that, there can be a great deal of cruelty, and if they're never trained in that way, our children get left out. How many children do you work with who, when the parents are sitting, they will just come and blast into the conversation because they can't hear the pauses. They can't hear the inflections. If the teacher is giving instructions to a class and they say, class, I want you to sit down, get out your crayons, and look at me. Everyone in this room just heard me say 3 things because I put bullet points into it. So did the teachers. Sit down, get out your crayons, look at me, da-da-da-da-da. And even if you didn't hear that last instruction, you heard there was a bullet point there, there's something else that you got to do. The children that I work with often, they sit down and they go, what's everyone else doing? And they look like they are malingering, they are not paying attention, when their brain simply can't hear it. Our kids get in a lot of trouble that they don't deserve to get into. Now, more specifically, and this is the part of our brain, too, that shuts out all that distracting stuff. There's so much going on here in this room if you really pay attention. There's a heating system, and people will cough, and a chair will move, and people shuffle papers. There's a lot happening auditorily. Visually, there's a lot to see. Tactily, you can feel you're sitting on the chair. You can feel your hand as it picks up the cup. But we put all of that aside. For our children, everything is in their face constantly. So I think that sometimes attention deficit disorder is an inadequate label. It's kind of like a surplus of attention to everything all the time. Or the opposite of that, which is shutting down and shutting it all out. Now, I want to also emphasize that at this stage of the central nervous system, we start to converge our eyes. So 2 eyes look at the same thing at the same time, and we get depth perception. And I work with many, many children. They say, she's so bright, but she can't read. In fact, most of my kids are those kids. So bright, but, and then all these blanks that they fill in. So bright, but she can't read. The little girl who prompted that thought, the thought for me, was a little girl who finally we sat down and said, what do the words look like when you see them on the page? She said, they're okay, except I hate how they go to the end of the page and then they wiggle off. But then sometimes they turn to colors, and then they're black, or then they're gray. This child had so many things going on, letters dancing up and down and going off the page, and most of the children that have that issue cannot describe it to you because they live in that. It's like, how does a fish describe water? And they may assume, I'm assuming they're assuming, that everyone else can do this very complicated function of making the letters stand still and make sense out of it, and they can't. so they must be stupid. So most of my kids, I think, are really smart. Now, this is the place in this social brain. I just wanted to come back to that because we are talking about trauma, and they pick up so much on your own expressions. The mirror neurons at that part of the brain are really activated. They are creating languages that sound like some kind of combination of Kwakwala and Korean. I remember my grandson at that stage, he would just walk up to you and say these brilliant things and look you right in the eye for an answer. And there were no words. It was just all paragraphs of emotion and observation and not one English word. So they are ready to be social. And if this part of the brain does not have both the developmental sequence in place and the appropriate parenting support, they may be very, very unable to do that. So our kids get made fun of. They can be the butt of jokes. They can be told, I know one little boy I work with said, came home from school, I have a new friend. And apparently what the kid had done at school is, yeah, like, right, I'm going to be your friend, stupid. So, but he can't read any of the intonation. So they get sadly bullied for their inability to hear those things. I want to really quickly run through a short story because if there's nothing else that you remember, I want you to remember this. We have worked with children over the course of time who have had severe difficulties with learning, with attention, with remembering, with sorting, with decoding words, wide range of, they have, like maybe they have high fluency, low comprehension. And over time, we have learned that what happens in their brain is that many of the children being raised over the last 25 years have spent a good deal of time in walkers, in jumpers, in bouncers, in all those things that prevent them from getting down on their hands and knees and getting out of their way and just letting them be babies and doing what babies do. Well, it appears from everything that we've been able to test in the absence of an fMRI, I mean, that's the only thing missing, is that those children do not make connections across the major bridge between the two sides of the brain called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the only thing that connects our right and left hemispheres. We have two very different brains, our right hemisphere being more intuitive, holistic, and artistic in general, and a lot of fantasy can go on there. Left brain being more linear and logical, and it's very much more complex than that, but if we can let that be for the moment, we'll kind of generalize. But when I work with those children who have been raised in that equipment, there's a very simple test. Were we to have more time, I'd even teach it to you. There's a very simple test that you can determine whether that child is firing information from one side of the brain to the other. In terms of working with children with trauma, this can be very, very important because sometimes you will tell them, I'm going to pick you up after school, wait in the principal's office. And they may get on the bus and go home. And you say, why didn't you wait in the principal's office for me? You never told me that. You're a liar. Everybody lies to me. And often the children that feel that everyone is lying to them can't remember. And sometimes they can't remember what you said to them. And sometimes they can't remember what they did. Like, did you give the teacher your homework this morning? And they'll say, yes, I did, because they just suddenly went into a panic and they get a nice big grin on their face and they say, yes, I did, because they can't remember or not, because the two sides of the brain aren't working together and processing that information across that corpus callosum is not happening for that child. If you start reading a lovely novel, movie starts happening. You start seeing that bridge. You start seeing the building in the sunset. You start seeing the airplane that's coming down. You start, and the whole movie starts to unfold in front of you. And for children that don't have that function, they can read all of the words in a line, but none of them end up making a story. Because words line up over here, and you have to rely on this part of the brain to kind of make that beautiful movie happen. And similarly, if you've just had something happen to you at school and it was very complicated and Sally was playing with Sarah, but they made you sit over there because they were not being your friends, but Sally used to be your friend and now Sally's friends with Sarah, and it's so complex. And they've got the picture in their head, but they can't send that information over to the place in the brain that can explain it to you. So lots of reading comprehension issues and inability to tell a story or write a story. And I have children who have that issue, and they can maybe tell the story, but they can't put it into words. So we have, and what puts that function into place, we have realized over time, and I want to credit my teacher, Florence Scott, for this discovery, is that babies must creep. They have to be on their hands and knees, their hands and knees, their hands and knees. And we live in a culture where it's really cool to get babies to do things early. And especially I find like in more impoverished communities, if you work in those communities, people are very proud of their very smart child who is walking at 9 months. Wow. Most children I work with who've started walking at 9 months have some impairment because they've skipped some major aspect of their development. They must be on their hands and knees. It helps develop balance. It pulls the eyes into alignment. It mediates the rotation alignment of the medial joints. It starts facilitating many, many functions at this level of the central nervous system because it is part of our natural development. We get in our babies' ways so much. All of the kids that I have worked with who have that issue, two sides of the brain connecting, were, for the most part, and there are exceptions, raised in walkers, jumpers, swings, saucers, bouncy chairs, or left in the car seat all day. And I want to tell you that we can raise perfectly healthy children without having all of that equipment. I think that one of the things that we have to look at socially is how our toy industry is geared, like every other industry, towards the bottom line, which is profit. And all of those things that come out looking like a really good invention, oh, the baby bumbo. Have you seen that darn thing? Oh, it's disgusting. It's a little plastic seat. You can put your baby as young as 9 months and they can sit up and get their spine exercised. They just sit there, so propped like this. All of those are so damaging. And I think the best use of all of that equipment is take your baby out of it, put the equipment behind your SUV, and back up over it. Don't even give it to the Goodwill. Because we are living in a culture in which babies are made to be more and more and more convenient because, unfortunately, mothers are not supported, so they are unable to stay home and provide babies with what they need. If they do stay home, they are not provided with a supportive social environment. I know that I have a sister-in-law who is from Belgium, and when she had a little baby, he was, for the first 6 months of his life, he cried really 24/7. I mean, it was horrendous for her. And she went to a wonderful, supportive facility in Belgium where she stayed for a week. She said, I'm going to kill this baby. I haven't slept in 4 months. You know how you get if you haven't slept. It's pretty awful. And they spent the night times with the baby and helping teach the baby how to comfort himself. And she got 7 nights of sleep, and they went home, and everybody was so much happier. We don't give mothers support. We don't give fathers support. We have an industry around children that is based on earning a lot of money, and we interrupt this developmental process all of the time. I work with very, very few children who've really been through a normal developmental progression. And these stages provide the foundation for us connecting to our children. When we're talking about connection with children, we have hopefully an available child and an available mom, and connection happens. And if we don't have an available mom, like she's stoned, or she abandoned the baby, or she goes off to work at Microsoft, which is right near me, for 16 hours a day, sometimes we have an available mom, we don't have an available baby. They can't make eye contact because of neurological impairment. Their skin is too sensitive to touch. We have to have available moms and available babies, and we have to understand what the baby needs to do to make themselves available for the nurturing that we offer them. And that's the gap that we're trying to close in working with children who are adopted, is to help the children grow in the context of these very loving families. And I just, when I think about the families that some of you have to work with in educating them in parenting, I just feel so blessed because I know I work with the best families in the planet. I mean, they really, want nothing more than to connect and to bond and to love and to nurture these little ones. Even when the little ones are biting them and kicking and saying very horrible things to their mother about her sexuality and all kinds of other behaviors, they are still, the parents are still right there trying to make it work for them. So what I want to tell you overall is that we cannot ignore that first year, and we cannot ignore the fact that babies have a really big job to do. I think it is arrogant on our part to assume that all the work is on us. Because babies come with these competencies. They come with these reflexes that they are ready to turn into a whole developmental progression. And if we are assuming that the whole burden is ours, we can deny them what is most fundamental. I've worked with the most loving mothers in the world who've held their babies for the first 6 months of life with no floor time. Because the baby needs both. Like if I look at this chart, I see half of it being input, sensory, half of it being motor. And what that kind of implies to me is half of our baby's time needs to be in that loving, comforting, nurturing, on our bodies kind of place, and half of it needs to be their independent struggle against gravity and the world and reaching without being able to get there and figuring out how do I make my body go 1 more inch so I can get that dust fuzzy that's on the floor so I can put it in my mouth. We have to honor them by saying, you have a competency too. So I think I've condensed 2 hours into 1. I did it, Kathy. I come to LA 4 times a year, something like that. And we're going to hope to do, I don't know, I was talking to Ruth, maybe we'll do a little bit more on this next year. Do a little bit more exploring of this. I really want to thank you and thank Kathy and thank Ruth and Louise, who kind of got me into this kind of at the last minute. So I appreciate it very much. Do we have time for 2 questions? 2 minutes, 2 questions. Boy, we're on. Okay. Yes.
In your work, obviously can't sum it up completely, but does you generally go back and kind of read?
Yes, exactly. And I do that across the age span. The oldest person I've ever worked with was a 90-year-old, and you know what he did? He crawled. And he did reflexes, and he worked with movement. I've worked with people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who've recovered. And my primary practice is children with developmental trauma from adoption, birth trauma, et cetera. And we go back and we repeat the developmental sequence where there's a gap. Okay. Any other question? Yes?
Can you speak to issues on the autistic spectrum in relationship?
Yes, I can quickly. In my looking at the situation, I work with a lot of children with autism. Autism seems to live at this midbrain and in the gut. If I had every child that I work with have a healthy gut and a healthy midbrain, I don't think we'd be looking at autism. And sometimes the gut is a much bigger feature in the autism diagnosis than the midbrain. But the midbrain is the social brain, the filtering brain. Right there, you get a sense, you know.
And in terms of therapeutic aspects?
The higher functioning they are on the autism spectrum, the more likely they are to recover. I recovered a little boy this year who was autism and fetal alcohol, and he's in Canada. He went back to the health system, and they said, sorry, Mom, you know, good news, bad news. He doesn't fit the criteria for receiving services anymore because we do not find any signs of autism or fetal alcohol syndrome. The bad news is, sorry, Mom, he doesn't qualify for services anymore. So, yes, autism can be impacted. It is probably the hardest neurological challenge to treat because your gut has 80% of your neurotransmitters are created in your gut lining, and autistic children have severely impaired guts. So, yes?
How can you explain where anger fits into this whole situation? In other words,
yes, limbic rage.
Where does that go back to? Does it go back to the sort of prenatal phase? I mean,
with every layer of this, we're looking at different ways. If you think about our growth as a spiral, okay, and each, as we spiral through, we sort of recycle through many, many functions. Like I had talked about the pain, how it's the deep seed of compassion. Anger, too, is at many, many levels. But one of the levels I work with the most is called limbic rage, which is a misfiring on the loop between the limbic system and the cortex, and can be triggered. It's different than anger. It is out of proportion to the situation. It is out of control. It is irrational. I work with children with limbic rage who are in the middle of throwing things and beating it on the wall. They'll say, I don't want to be doing this. Please make me stop. I don't want to be doing this. So that's limbic rage. Anger is a good thing. But some of the rage behaviors we see.
How do you work with that? Just,
Not cognitively. We work with reflex, movement, and sensation. And we want all of our children to be getting the good psychotherapy and parenting support. So if anyone wants to stay, I can answer a few more questions and give you just a couple. I'll give you a couple things to look at in the kids that you work with. Okay? Yes. Any other questions?
I mean, I'm just wondering, I'm not going to be able to fill in all the gaps for the kids we work with, but if there's some strategies that I might try, should I get on the floor and crawl with them?
The
or
best
should
strategy, I think, at this point, you have like 1 hour of information, and we just finished doing our certification program from some students in Minnesota, and it was a year-long program, so clearly there's a lot to learn. But I think the best thing is that if you can take any one piece of this, or 3 or 4 pieces, and use it as a kind of sorting or teasing device to separate out what a child won't do from what they can't do. Like the child who was raging while screaming, please stop me, I don't want to do this. And some children can't be that blatant about it, but other children are screaming on the inside, I can't stop myself. The impulse is there before it is, like we had discussed so beautifully on Monday. It happens before you realize it's happening. So if you can just start seeing these children, the playground bully is a good example. Why is he bullying? Where's his compassion? What's his history? Is he the playground bully who also walks like the little snowman? I just saw this kid. It was the reason we didn't send my grandbaby to this particular nursery school is because this kid dominated the class. But he had that, like I talked about, the slumpy back and the slumpy shoulders, and he'd just walk into kids and push them across off the playground equipment. And his eyes crossed, and he'd fall over. And we could see the neurological deficits, and it's like, yes, I know what to do with this, and no, I don't want my sweet little grandbaby in the same classroom. It's just too much. I can't deal with it, and But I could have compassion for him instead of thinking he's the mean kid. So that to take a look at the children that have the high thresholds for heat, cold, pain, and hunger. Is the self-cutting behaviors always just a psychological? No, actually, I've never seen it unless the child also has a high pain threshold. Also, so it goes in tandem. Or anorexia. So if you can sort it out a bit. The child that they say they have high fluency, low comprehension, or they don't seem to remember things from 1 minute to the next. We teach it to them one day, and the next day they've forgotten it all. They very likely don't have that full midbrain functioning. And I want to say one aside to that. The corpus callosum is a piece of your brain that if it weren't functioning at all, you would be severely disabled. But it's the quality of the firing between the 2 hemispheres that we want to look at. So the kids that have never crept on their hands and knees, which triggers that firing, those kids probably have the poor memory, the trust issues for some kids, the low comprehension, sort of spaced outlook. So I just want to give people the mindset that there are things going on in these kids that they can't tell us, and we have to be really good observers, or else get a really good evaluation of them to understand what's going on for them. Yes.
Are there people in LA who do this work?
No, I'm the person in LA who does this work. Yeah, I'm the person.
There was a certification program that was just completed in Minnesota.
Yes, and those people are almost. They're mostly the Midwest. What we're trying to do is set up a certification program here in LA because we just finished one in Minnesota, and too many of us were up in the Northwest, so we decided let's do a training in Minnesota. And if any of you want to look into this wonderful facility, it's a chance to grow. They provide this work. They provide audio-visual entrainment, neurofeedback, auditory integration, vision therapy, tutoring, and then there's a school in the facility. It's this wonderful. It's about as big as this building, 6 gymnasiums. It's all about movement, reflex, and sensory learning to get these kids well. Their population happens to be more the children with cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, and severe head injuries. So I can tell you about our severe head injury boy, who, because this is a wonderful, wonderful story, and it just makes me proud. But it also gives me a way to say about the power of the brain to heal itself. We worked with a boy that was 12 years old in Seattle, and he was walking home from school, and there was a sort of traditional crossing where the kids all went together as a gang, you know, sort of rollicking and laughing and spilling their Cokes and hitting each other in the back of the head as they go across the street. Well, they weren't quite in the crosswalk. Nonetheless, a van blew through the crosswalk and struck this boy in the head with the mirror, and the left side of his brain was literally pushed into the right side of his skull. I've seen the medical imaging of his brain. It doesn't even look like a human brain. He was in our local trauma hospital, Harborview, and the doctor came in and told his mother that he felt that it was appropriate to unplug him because he was never going to recover. At which point, this very fierce mother looked at him and said, "You did not say that, and we are not having this conversation. Get out of my room." And she just claimed her space around her son. They took him home. We started putting him on the floor. Now, how many people would put a boy with a severe head injury on his stomach on the floor? Nobody but us. Within about 2 weeks, he was starting to go in and out of the coma. He started throwing things at the dog. He started pushing buttons on the phone. Within 6 months, he said his first word. His first word happened to be to our French intern, who is very sweet and very bubbly. And she's always like, "Nick, you're my sweet boy. Please, I would love to talk to you." Oh, just this pretty little French girl. And his first word, as an English-speaking child who has been in a coma without language, is "bonjour." He graduated. This happened he was 12. At the age of 18, he graduated from high school at grade level. He's still in a wheelchair, but he's graduated. So we do work with and the body has a tremendous capacity to help our brain integrate. So I want you to remember two things. If we allow the space for our children to do what they need to do, they become more whole emotionally, physically, psychologically, and academically. If we deny that, they become less whole. If we injure them, we can impair those systems so we don't have the available baby that can connect with the available parent, the available therapist. Denise Best has written an article about how she uses this particular approach in attachment therapy. She said she went to a lecture like this and left and cried. She said, "I've been doing it wrong for 20 years. I've been asking my kids to do things they simply can't do, and I'm going to change everything I do. Because my kids, I'm asking them to do the impossible." I call it color camp, some of the approaches that are taken. A color camp is where you send a bunch of colorblind boys to color camp for the summer, and they have red teams and green teams, and they have red flags and green flags, and they have red cabins and green cabins, and at the end of the summer, you say, "Okay, which one's red, which one's green?" "I don't know." You're asking them to learn things that their brain simply cannot learn, and a lot of our kids get sent to color camp. You were asking them to do things they simply can't do. So, thank you.